But you can't complain about being the solver of the problem, but then continue to just go, okay, I'll be the solver of the problem.
Exactly.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And I wanted to say welcome to a few of our newest members of the Facebook group.
Yes.
We have Chris Morosco, Christine Collins, Chris Miller, and Heather McKay, who we may have mentioned before, but that's okay.
We can greet her again.
We can re-welcome you. We're so happy to have you all in part of the group. We can't wait to hear more about you. And if you have not jumped into the Facebook group, you can text the word story to 345-345 to get those instructions, or find us on our website at sohere'smystory.com.
Okay.
Take it away.
All right. So here's my story. Tonight, I start a new semester for Towson, public speaking. And public speaking is a course which so many people dread, but so many people have to take because it's a requirement, to Towson's credit, I think, in quite a few majors.
Oh, that's smart. I didn't know that they required it. But
they require it
because it applies to everything.
And even in things that you wouldn't expect, like in IT, it's a requirement. And I love that. It's one of the things I really like about Towson. Anyway, so what that means is it's not unusual for me to get an email or two from students saying, hey, I need to take public speaking, or even a few saying, I really think I should take public speaking, but I've been locked out of a course and yours is the only one that fits in my schedule because I teach it in the evenings. Mm-hmm. Can you please let me into your class? And I got one of these.
Is your story about having people beg to be in your class?
Well, yes, but I'm insightful enough to know that it's not, can I please be in Mr. Wagenheim's class, so much as it is, can I please be in the 5 o'clock Thursday class? I think that's really their emphasis. So I got one of these yesterday from a student saying that she is now a second semester senior. And while she's knocked out her requirements for graduation, she doesn't need this to graduate. She feels that in her chosen field, she could be better at it. And she's always been nervous, but she's worked up the nerve and she wants to get in, but she's locked out. And this is the class that matches her schedule or fits in her schedule. Can I do this? So my initial reaction is always, well, of course you can.
Right.
Because
student hungry to learn.
Student hungry to learn in something I feel is important and I think I can be helpful to her. Absolutely. So instead of responding the way I normally do, and the only thing that held me back from saying absolutely is because, frankly, I'm never sure with Towson procedure how I can add somebody over the ceiling of the class because they changed that. So I'd have to write in anyway. Even if I said absolutely, I might not be accurate in that. So I wrote to, I think she's the vice chair of the department, really, really nice and extremely capable person, Lisa Tarowski. And I said, Lisa, hey, here's this email from a student. What do you think? I said, I don't mind adding her. I know it's one extra student. I don't mind adding her, but how do you think I should respond and whatever? And she said, well, it's not a graduation requirement, and she's really waiting until the 11th hour to contact you. And I would say that, and then she directed me to the steps and who to direct her to. But the tone of Lisa's email was not absolutely not, but it was really much more like, you know what? That's her issue. And Lisa is the nicest person. Right. But it struck me that what Lisa does in that situation, I have another one as well, but what Lisa does is she acts as kind of like the enforcer of policy. She goes against my natural, certainly I want to be accommodating, how can I help you and all this stuff. And she stands up for the policies are in place for a reason. And she's told me before, look, and she said in adjunct professor meetings, you may be tempted to add people. I'm telling you now it's a mistake because you already have a lot of people, which we do. 22 people in a public speaking class is a lot. Yeah.
Because that's not just to listen to knowledge and absorb it. You really have to incorporate everyone. And yeah,
it's very customized. I give them customized feedback. I send them emails. So it's a lot. And she said, so you really have to fight against that. And you have to say, look, we have 22. There's a waiting list. If you want to see if there's an opening by the drop ad date, just keep tabs on it. And you can hit send as quickly as you can if you see an opening. But that's about it. Work within the policy as opposed to making a policy exception. And I value that voice.
Well, especially since, and don't lose your train of thought because I know there's another component to this, but I'm sort of drawing this continuum on my paper as you were talking. You know, there's the people who will say yes to everything. Then there's what you're calling like the enforcer. But what's interesting is it doesn't sound like she is the sorry, that's the policy end of story, because she said like, well, if this was a graduation requirement, like so she has like a filter to say like, you know, this is not an emergency. And so therefore,
right.
You know,
and she's giving the student someplace to go instead of placing the onus on the professor. She's saying to the student, look, drop ad is here. People may drop. You can, you know, instead of the student said, could you please let me know if there's an opening? She said, no. The student can keep checking PeopleSoft or Blackboard and see. And in the business world, so in my law firm, you know, I've had situations where people would come in and they would say, hey, listen, I was hoping that I could take this time off or leave early this day because I have X, Y, and Z. And my initial reaction is almost always, yeah, absolutely. Unless there's a trial going on or something happening. Absolutely. However, Kim here, you know, Kim is likely, and she's certainly compassionate and understands people's needs, but she would also be saying, no, wait a minute, she can do that on the weekend. There's no reason that she has to leave. It's not for surgery, it's a manicure or whatever it is. You know, so Kim is more likely to look at something and go, no, she can find another way. And I recognize that I can work with my team in setting whatever personnel policies and guidelines we have. I'm not the right person to enforce them because I don't really want whatever personality issues there are. I don't want to be the bad guy here. I don't want to do this. And I need an enforcer. I need somebody who's going to draw a line.
Well, some people are better at filtering in all sorts of different ways of like some people are better at making some things not binary. Like for you, if it was a sort of a stereo equalizer, if you have a really good reason, you said, like if there's a trial, it's not like you don't know how to say no. Right. You don't mind, you don't have a pathological avoidance of being the bad guy. You will have hard conversations, but you have to have a really good reason to say no because you're like, well, we can make that work. So yes. We'll work around it, and which is great, I think, most of the time. But that ability to filter more in a more nuanced way in between the yes and the no and be a little more clear. So it's why I have Karen. It's one of the reasons I have Karen do my scheduling is that if somebody says, do you have time this week? I will almost always say, oh, okay, I can move this, I can wiggle that, which Karen knows when it's worth doing that and other times when it can kind of wait. And she'll be like, no, you're booked this week. And I said, no, I have time here. And she goes, Jody, that's a full calendar. You don't need to squeeze another person in. Right. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. Because I will regret it. Like if I have then crammed it in where I can't even, I'm rushing from thing to thing. I don't have time to think about it or write down follow-ups or whatever. So she is my, I don't even think of it as an enforcer, but my not navigator. I can't quite think of the word, mitigator almost of just to pause. That's
like the
really,
voice of reason. Almost.
The voice of reason, because in those moments, those conversations have gone both ways. Like sometimes I've seen an email when somebody's scheduling where she says Jody's booked. I'm like, no, I could fit them in this week, and she's like, no, you're really booked. Sometimes I'm like, you're right, I am. Put them into next week. Sometimes I'm like, oh no, this is like a mission critical crisis. Yeah. Although I usually communicate that to her in advance now, but you can always have, I think that's the point. You can always have exceptions, but this enforcer, as you're calling it, person, is the person who makes sure that the exception doesn't just accidentally become the rule, which then you have to have even a higher stake for an exception.
Yeah. And so there are a couple different nuances when you're talking about the calendar, which is exactly where I wanted to go on this. So there's a big push. I won't say it's now because it's been going on for a while, but there are a number of these apps, Schedule Once, Calendly, there are a number of them where instead of when a client calls you and says, hey, do you have time to meet? And you could email them that says, here's a bullet point list of 5 different dates and times, which might work. If any of those work for you, get back to me. If not, let me know your times. So these Schedule Once and Calendly and a host of others are a link that syncs with your calendar where somebody can go onto your calendar and they can choose a time that works. And that's great. It's really helpful because it takes that back and forth out of it. But
however,
what I've also found is sometimes when I've sent people the link, I don't keep it on the website so that vendors can just book time with me, but I've sent people the link. And when they've booked something, I've thought,
exactly. That's why I had to stop using it because it'll let you book. Well, I mean, there are times when you can put in buffers.
You can put buffers
and things, but still.
But it doesn't necessarily know that after this 1 hour conversation or whatever, I really need some time to think about this and maybe do something. I need some space in between.
Yeah.
That's not just daydreaming out the window. I mean, it's really needed.
It's like cogitation time.
Right. And if I have that 10 o'clock to 11 and then 11:15 to 12 and then 12:15, I'm not going to serve people well. And so the ability to rationally schedule is missing from these apps. And sometimes the ability to rationally schedule, you've outsourced to Karen, many times.
So it's interesting though. I have certain things, I don't put it all on the app because the app in and of itself actually can be very useful if you have the app open to your entire schedule and they can put it anywhere they want, then yes, then it's missing this enforcer thing. You can actually I've set this up for clients, you can use that app as the enforcer for things like, I had a client who we ended up thinking through the different types of coffees that he was having, because he was having all these, and he would say yes to any one coffee, all the time. And because he really could sell to just about anybody.
Right.
And, but a lot of them were just kind of pointless. And so he decided like he could have X number of those per week, but it was really hard for him. He knew he was going to have a problem saying, oh, the next time I can meet you is 3 weeks from now. And his direct quote was, I'm not a dermatologist, and so he knew he was going to have that issue. So what we did for him was we used one of those apps. We set up these very specific coffee appointments with a potential at a couple of very key places that worked for him logistically, with a little buffer before and after for travel time. And those were the only things available in that link. And so when somebody's like, oh, I'd love to have coffee, here's my link for that kind of appointment, people would go. And if there was one like 3 weeks out, they were fine. No one was ever upset by that because these were just like random networking coffees. But it put in that enforcer where he didn't have to look at his calendar and make that decision and feel bad about it.
That's true. But what he did was, you have Karen. He decided he worked with you, and he outsourced the enforcer role, this time to an app, which makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But you first have to have the willingness to subvert your instinct to accommodate and your fear of disappointing somebody else or not being seen as open or willing to meet with them. You have to be okay with that. And
what's interesting is he would never send his very best clients to that. Like active current clients don't get that link because he will work them in. He'll cancel something if he has to. And so the importance of like stacking things so that you can say, I think this through a lot. A lot of times when people have an issue, like they just have this big issue of, because it's not like I'm a productivity person. Calendaring is not my specialty in the world, but he was coming with this big blur of an issue that felt like time and productivity, and he was making it up into all sorts of different things. I'm like, well, if you actually just break it down into pieces, like these people need to have some wrangling around when and how often you're doing this kind of meeting. And so we set up an enforcing structure around that to make it easier because we knew where his pitfalls would be, which as a quick side note, I think is such an overlooked thing. How often there's a want to overlook the human component of a thing, the likelihood that a person will actually take that action or will like fall down on a thing. It may be silly. It may be embarrassing to admit, like in that example, I will feel bad telling somebody 3 weeks out. Doesn't matter. If you want to solve the problem, just like shamelessly admit the limitation you have of a thing. If you want to work on that personal development of getting better at saying 3 weeks out, whatever. But in the meantime, craft up a solution that makes the problem easier and get over yourself.
Right. Well, we've been talking about the appointments and the calendars. And in some respects, that's an easier one. But when you talk about enforcement, sometimes it's more difficult conversations that don't lend themselves to an app. It could be dress code. It could be that you have a coworker who is always dropping into your office, and maybe not just to talk about his kids or his vacation plans or whatever. Maybe he's talking about legitimate work issues or wants to check in with you on certain things.
Right.
But
it's still...
It's interrupting your flow and you can't get your block time. And how do I say, hey, you got to stop coming in here all the time without being that guy, without... whether you outsource it or you figure out a way to do it, there's some aspect of my personality as the enforcer that I have to tap into and either outsource or figure out how I can utilize.
Well, there's another super important point that you mentioned that I feel like I've been having a conversation about a lot, both with my kids and then also with several clients. In that story you told about Lisa, was that her name? Lisa. Yeah. A really important part of that, because we've been focusing very much on that like internal decision. So Lisa's process of what matters, what doesn't, when is it my problem, when is it your problem, Elliot, when is it the student's problem. But that last one is I think the most important part. She seems to have a really keen sense of when to take on the issue and try and fix it. Because we've been focusing on whether she says yes or no. And that's actually the result on the other side of a thing where first it sounds like she is much more clear and keen on, is this my problem? I guess it's my problem to solve. And
Correct.
She's like, oh, actually, we don't even really need to make that decision because this student has another option already. This student can watch the this, that, and the other. So it's almost like circumventing the entire, I'm making air quotes, enforcer part of the question of having to be better at saying no. You're actually not saying no. You're saying, hey, this actually isn't even a conversation we need to be having because you have another option.
Right. My way of reading that email, the way I received the email from the student was, can I solve her problem? And the answer is yes. The way that Lisa looked at it is, should we be solving her problem?
Yes.
And the answer in that case is not necessarily no.
Right,
No.
right. And that to me is much more enlightening. This is a very specifically relevant thing for me right now because I have teenagers and
Sure.
deciding when, as you well know, can I solve their problems? Currently, most of them, yes, they will absolutely have problems that I cannot solve. But at the moment, most of the things that come into my line of sight are things I can solve. And I have to constantly draw back and say, should I? And I try to start with no. Like, can I give them some practice at solving this problem? And for some reason, I think that's, I won't say it's easier. It's more apparently important that I do so when you're looking at your teenagers who are soon to be out of the house. So that really ramps up the like, oh gosh, they need to know how to fix this. But I think it gets stepped over in the business world about how often, you want to be, it comes from a good place. You want to be helpful. You want to be accommodating. You want to make something better. And yet you then have to think about the unintended consequences of breeding that behavior as the go-to.
You do, but in the business world, I know you do in parenting as well, but in the business world, my mind goes to, okay, well, who bears the brunt of that decision? So if I have a coworker that wants to come in and say, hey, how do I handle this at a hearing that's coming up? And I say, figure it out for yourself. Yes, he or she may become better at that, or the client may suffer because he or she didn't know how to do it at the hearing. So you have to balance out, well, ultimately, what's the consequence of my not solving the problem for the person who's coming in?
Well, see, that is why this isn't a no-brainer black and white issue, because I think you always have to consider the timelines of the things. Like in the moment, I can think of like 3 or 4 different levels to that. Like, yeah, in the moment you may say, here, let me fix that. But if it's something that has happened more than once, or if it's something that will come back, you have to have some kind of backup that like retrains the person. Or I had a thing where somebody was asking me for the logins for a thing over and over again. And I kept saying, I thought we made a document. Like, can we put that? And it was this client where I was working, sort of embedded, but sort of out. And we were trying to figure out where we put files and stuff. And this young man kept coming to me over and over and saying, well, how can I get to that? How can I get to that? And I knew that stuff was in that file. And so, my gut wanted to say every single time, have you checked the file? Because I knew it was in there and it was just easier for him to ask me. And I had to decide every time, like, is this the moment where I do it? Because sometimes there was something actually on the line and I would just say, do this, get it done, da, 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 da. But every other time, if at all possible, I would say, check the file. And he's like, oh, right. I forgot about the file. And slowly he started to remember that there's a file and he doesn't have to ask me. But I think there's this nuanced difference. But if what you do is, if it always seems easier to just solve the problem, then what you are saying is, I will be the solver of this problem. And if you're not okay with that, then you need to find a different way.
Right. And then you, as somebody who owns a business, you think, well, if I'm always the solver of the problem, why am I writing this check to you for? So
only that, and how exhausting is it to be the solver? You can't complain about being the solver of the problem, but then continue to just go, okay, I'll be the solver of the problem.
Exactly. So you have to,
especially if you use that Eeyore voice.
You have to figure out what you're going to tolerate, what really irritates you, like the password issue, and how you resolve it. And also, going back to my story, what you're good at and what you're not. And I'm not really good at being the enforcer when it comes to, or the protector, I should say, the protector of my own time, my own, mental resources. Mm-hmm. Just like you were saying, I could fit that in. Yeah, I could accommodate you. Mm-hmm. I could do this. And I'm not being an effective guardian of what I do best.
Yes. I like that word guardian. That to me...
It's better than enforcer.
Well, because enforcer is a much more fun word, but
yeah.
but enforcer implies to me a much more black and white, like I am the person who says no, like an absolutely not. Guardian to me, it really gets a little bit more into the nuance of considered decision making, where you're weighing, you're scanning all the different things, like how urgent is this? Right back to your original story. If that had been a graduation requirement and it was the last semester, there's no way Lisa would have said no. Right. She would have made sure the girl graduated.
Yes.
But she was like, oh, you know what? This is not a mission. Lives do not hang in the balance. She has other options. There are other ways around this. And
the same way when you were talking about even the calendar app.
Right.
Because when you program it well, when you build in everything, it's not an enforcer, it's not black and white, but it is a guardian to what you consider to be top of the line priority.
And I think why that matters, just as we're wrapping up here, is it's easy in those. I think part of the reason it's hard to be the guardian for you and the things you were talking about is in that moment, you're like, what's really at stake? Like, is it a big deal if I throw her in here? But here's what's possibly at stake. I can make up this story. And because Lisa does this all day long, she probably has seen this story, and it probably makes it easier for her to know that it's the right thing to not always say yes. Is, let's say she let this young lady in, and 5 or 6 or 8 or other people, now you're at 25 or 26 students, truly over the limit. And then someone comes in who does have a graduation requirement and who, let's make it even worse, did register for the class, but somehow by the system messing up, got deleted, really truly needs to be in this class and deserves to be and did all the right things. And she can't put the person in. Like, there are consequences. You can't always see them. But I think the hardest thing about having better guardian skills of your time and energy is knowing that there are casualties, even if you can't see them. And so you have to remember that.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories. You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.